Picture this: China, 400s BCE. A minister walks into the royal court. He's prepared his report. He knows his numbers, knows his argument, knows he's right. He also knows that 3 of his colleagues made similar presentations in the last year, and none of them walked out. The men who survived that court weren't the loudest, weren't the most brilliant, and weren't the most loyal. They were the ones who had learned how to be invisible while standing in plain sight. Wu Wei wasn't a yoga pose. It wasn't a breathing exercise or a philosophy for people with too much free time. It was a survival technology built by and for people whose mistakes got them killed. So the question is, what does a 2,400-year-old political survival strategy actually have to do with the pressure you're sitting under right now? The world that built Wu Wei, to understand what Wu Wei was designed to do, you need to feel the world it came out of, because it wasn't a peaceful one. The Warring States period ran roughly from 475 BCE to 221 BCE. 7 major kingdoms, Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Wei, and Zhao, spent almost 250 years trying to destroy each other. And this wasn't like a Cold War with long stretches of quiet tension. Battles happened constantly, cities fell, entire ruling families got wiped out. The borders on the map changed faster than any administrator could track, and if your kingdom lost ground, everyone who served that kingdom's interests became a liability to whoever moved in next. For the scholars and advisors working inside these courts, the professional environment was something most of us can barely imagine. You weren't just worried about being passed over for promotion. If your council led to a military defeat, you could be executed. If your ruler fell out of favor with a stronger neighbor and capitulated, you were now a stranger in a court that had no reason to trust you. If you gave advice that embarrassed the king publicly, you might not make it home for dinner. The scholar Shangyang, who engineered the legal reforms that made Qin the most powerful state, was eventually torn apart by chariots when the king he served died and enemies moved against him. That's not a metaphor. That's what happened to people who got the politics wrong. This is the environment Laozi was writing into. The Tao Te Ching wasn't addressed to monks sitting in mountain caves. Almost every chapter reads as direct counsel to rulers and ministers. Chapter 17 describes different grades of leadership. Chapter 30 warns against military overreach. Chapter 68 talks about leading without dominating. These aren't spiritual abstractions, they're operational guidelines for people who needed to stay effective and stay alive inside one of the most dangerous political systems in human history. So when you read Wu Wei in that context, the whole text shifts. These weren't ideas designed to help someone feel more relaxed. They were written for people with real enemies, real consequences, and very short margins for error. What Wu Wei actually meant then. The literal translation of Wu Wei is usually given as non-doing or acting without forcing. And if you stop there, it sounds like passivity, like the advice is just chill out, stop trying so hard, let things happen. That reading is wrong, and the mistake is expensive if you apply it. In the political world Laozi was describing, Wu Wei meant something much more precise. Don't make your influence visible enough to become a target. Let outcomes appear to emerge on their own. Move the pieces without anyone watching your hands. Chapter 17 of the Tao Te Ching puts it directly. The best ruler, it says, is one the people barely know exists, not because he's absent or passive, but because his influence is so well placed, so embedded in the structure of things, that nobody can point to a moment where force was applied. There's no fingerprint on the result. That's not weakness, that's the highest form of political control available, because it's the only kind that doesn't generate organized opposition. Laozi's core argument to rulers was this: the leader who has to raise his voice to command has already lost something. The one who shapes outcomes quietly, who positions things so that people move in the direction he needs them to move without feeling pushed, that's the one holding actual power. Visibility in that framework is a tax on your effectiveness. Every time you visibly assert control, you create a record of what you want, and that record can be used against you. This is strategic invisibility, and it's worth being clear about what it is and isn't. You're still acting, you're still deciding, still steering, still fully engaged with the outcome. You're just not announcing the mechanism. The difference between Wu Wei and passivity is the difference between a skilled surgeon and someone who refuses to pick up the knife. One of them knows exactly where to cut and how deep. The other just isn't doing anything. The Huang Lao school, which took Taoist ideas and built them into a governing philosophy during the early Han dynasty, made this concrete. After the Qin dynasty collapsed and China had spent decades in brutal war, the early Han emperors used Wu Wei as actual policy. They reduced central interference, kept taxes low, let local systems stabilize without constant intervention from above, and the result was one of the most rapid economic recoveries in Chinese history. Emperors Wen and Jing, who ruled from around 180 to 141 BCE, presided over a period so stable and prosperous it later got called the rule of Wen and Jing. They didn't build that by being passive. They built it by knowing exactly when not to push and what would grow on its own if they got out of the way. That's the original version of Wu Wei, not a feeling, a policy, a set of decisions about where not to apply force, made by people who understood force very well. How it got domesticated. So, somewhere between the Han dynasty and your yoga teacher's Instagram, Wu Wei got completely transformed, and it didn't happen through bad intentions. It happened through a series of translations, each one pulling the idea a little further from its original context, until what arrived in the West bore almost no resemblance to what Laozi actually wrote. The Western import of Taoism moved mostly through 20th century counterculture. The Beat generation picked it up in the 1950s as a rejection of post-war American conformity. Jack Kerouac referenced it. Gary Snyder studied it seriously. By the 1960s, it had filtered into the broader spiritual seeking movement, and that's when Alan Watts got hold of it. Watts was genuinely brilliant. His lectures are still worth listening to, and he understood Eastern philosophy at a level most Western academics didn't, but he was translating for a specific audience, people exhausted by industrial society, alienated from their bodies, desperate for permission to slow down. That audience needed something. What they didn't need was a political survival manual for courtiers in a collapsing kingdom. So Watts gave them what they could use, Wu Wei as liberation, as the art of letting go, as proof that the frantic effort the modern world demanded was itself the problem. That's not wrong exactly, but it's about 30% of the original idea, and it's the 30% with the lowest stakes. When you strip out the political context, a few things disappear. The original reader was someone with genuine enemies, someone for whom a miscalculation could end in execution or exile. The original text was written to keep that person effective under pressure, not to help them feel more present at breakfast. Once the audience shifts to people whose main problem is stress rather than survival, the concept softens to match. Wu Wei stops being a precision tool and starts being a general permission to ease up. The wellness industry completed the flattening. By the time Wu Wei reached the candle and crystal market, it had become pure aesthetic, a hashtag, a vibe to aspire to on a Sunday morning when you don't feel like checking email. There's a version of it sold as the philosophical justification for doing less, and people buy it because they're tired, which is understandable, but that reading is built on a misunderstanding that Laozi himself would not recognize. The thing that got erased is the most important part. The original reader wasn't someone with too much leisure. They were someone navigating a volatile, dangerous environment, trying to stay effective and stay alive. Wu Wei was written to sharpen them, not to help them relax. The softer the translation gets, the less it serves the people who actually need it most, which is the real irony here. The version most available is the version least useful to anyone under actual pressure. Wu Wei as a pressure strategy. Let's get concrete about what the original version actually looks like when it's working. The classic use case in ancient China was a minister serving a volatile ruler. Not a bad ruler necessarily, just unpredictable. The kind of leader who could reward you generously one season and have you removed the next if you reminded him of a failure he wanted to forget. The minister's problem wasn't how to do his job. He knew how to do his job. The problem was how to stay influential long enough to actually get anything done in a system that punished visibility at the wrong moment. The core mechanic Wu Wei gave him was this: reduce visible effort, increase actual effect. Don't be the person whose fingerprints are on everything. Position outcomes so they appear to arrive naturally. When you do need to push at the point where the least force produces the most movement, and then step back before anyone watches you do it. The minister who mastered this wasn't passive. He was operating at a level of sophistication that looked like passivity to people who didn't understand the game. This maps directly onto high-pressure modern environments in ways that are almost uncomfortable to look at. Think about the people in your organization or industry who have lasted, who keep accumulating influence without making enemies fast enough to lose it. They're almost never the loudest voice in the room. They're not the ones who win every argument by volume. They're the ones who know which arguments are worth having at all, who can read a room well enough to understand when pushing back will cost more than it gains, and who can serve their credibility for the moments it actually shifts something. Knowing when not to act is a decision. That sounds obvious, but it's not how most high performers are built. Most of us were trained on a model where effort is the visible thing, where showing up hard and loud and constantly is how you prove your value. Wu Wei in its original form runs directly against that training, because it says the discipline isn't in the doing, it's in recognizing when doing is exactly the wrong move, and sitting with that when every instinct is screaming at you to fix it, argue it, control it. Laozi came back to water again and again as his model for this. Water doesn't attack what blocks it. It finds every available path around the obstacle, accumulates quietly, and given enough time, reshapes the rock entirely without ever throwing a single punch. The rock looks like it's winning right up until it doesn't. That's not a metaphor about relaxation. That's a description of strategic patience in a system where direct force keeps getting deflected. Applied to a career or an organization, this is resource management at a level most people never reach. You have a finite amount of credibility, political capital, energy, and attention from the people who matter. Every time you spend that capital on a fight you didn't need to have, on a battle where you were right but winning cost you the relationship, on visible effort that generated resistance instead of results, you've burned something you can't immediately replace. The advisors who collapsed in the warring states' courts weren't usually undone by enemies. They were undone by their own overreach, by becoming visible and costly at exactly the wrong moment. Why the original version is what you actually need. If you've been working at a serious level for 20 or 30 years, you already know what maximum effort without strategy produces. You've felt it. The decade of grinding that moved things, followed by the years where the same approach started returning less and costing more, the point where hard work stopped being the answer and you couldn't quite name what the actual answer was. The hustle model has a shelf life, and it's not infinite. It works early, when the gains are proportional to the input, and the body and the appetite for friction are both at their peak. It stops working when the environment gets complex enough that effort alone can't navigate it, when what's needed isn't more force, but better placement of the force you still have. Wu Wei in its original form is a second act strategy, not because it's for people who've given up, but because it requires a level of self-knowledge and situational awareness that usually only comes from having already played the first act fully. You can't know which battles aren't worth fighting if you've never actually fought any. You can't feel the difference between strategic patience and avoidance unless you've had years of both. The ministers who used Wu Wei most effectively weren't young men trying it out. They were experienced operators who had already learned what force couldn't do. The question the original concept keeps pushing on isn't how to do more, it's what would actually happen if you stopped forcing the thing you're currently forcing. Not as a rhetorical exercise, but as a real diagnostic. What are you pushing right now where the resistance is telling you something? What would move on its own if you removed your hands from it? What are you holding in place that would find a better position without you? Those aren't soft questions. They're the hardest questions a person who's used to solving things through effort can sit with, because they require you to consider the possibility that your intervention is the problem, not the solution. The advisors who lasted longest in that period weren't the most relentless. They were the most precise about where their energy actually mattered, and patient enough to wait for those moments instead of manufacturing them constantly. You've already accumulated the experience they were working to build. Wu Wei, the real version, is the operating system for deploying it without burning yourself down in the process. Strategic expansion, the hidden mechanics of non-action. There's a mechanic inside Wu Wei that almost never gets discussed, even in serious academic treatments of Taoism, and it's the part that actually explains how non-action produces results instead of just producing absence. The Chinese political theorists who inherited Laozi's framework, particularly the writers who compiled what we now call the Huainanzi in the 2nd century BCE, spent a lot of time on a specific problem. How does a ruler govern a large, complex system without constantly intervening? And their answer pointed at something that modern systems thinkers would recognize immediately. The most stable systems are the ones that self-correct. The role of the person at the top isn't to run everything. It's to set up the conditions under which good outcomes become the path of least resistance for everyone else. That sounds abstract, so here's what it looked like in practice. A Han Dynasty governor applying Huanglao principles didn't micromanage local agriculture. He didn't issue edicts about planting schedules or crop rotation. He set tax rates low enough that farmers had real incentive to experiment and invest in their own land. Then he stayed out of it. The outcomes that followed looked like they happened naturally, because for the farmers, they did. Nobody felt administered, nobody felt pushed, and the governor's influence was total, because he'd shaped the incentive structure that every single decision downstream flowed through. That's Wu Wei operating at scale, invisible architecture producing visible results. The legalist thinkers of the same era, people like Han Fei, actually borrowed this piece of the framework, while rejecting almost everything else about Taoism. Han Fei argued that a ruler should use Wu Wei not as a spiritual practice, but as a surveillance mechanism. If the ruler stays quiet and reveals nothing of his own preferences, ministers can't perform for him. They have to actually produce results, because they don't know what performance he's looking for. The ruler's stillness becomes a diagnostic tool. It surfaces who actually knows what they're doing and who's been running on optics. That's a long way from go with the flow. That's cold, deliberate, strategic, emptiness used as a management instrument. The second hidden mechanic is about timing, and it connects to something Laozi described using the concept of shi, which translates roughly as the propitious moment, or the right configuration of circumstances. Wu Wei doesn't mean never act. It means don't act until shi arrives, until the conditions are aligned in a way that makes your action coherent with what's already moving. Force applied at the right moment, with the right vector, does exponentially more than the same force applied constantly in all directions. Military strategists of the Warring States period understood this viscerally. Sun Tzu's writing is full of it. The idea that the winning general wins first and then fights, rather than fighting and hoping to win. He's reading the terrain, the weather, the supply lines, the morale of both armies, and he's waiting for the configuration where his action tips a balancer that's already shifting. The battle itself is almost a formality. The work happened in all the patient observation and positioning before anyone picked up a weapon. That same principle applied inside courts and ministries. The advisor who waited for Shai, who held his counsel until the moment when the ruler was genuinely receptive and the political environment would carry the argument, consistently outperformed the one who pushed the right idea at the wrong time and lost the room. Timing in a political system isn't a soft consideration. It's the variable that determines whether your effort lands or disappears, whether you build credibility or spend it, whether you move things forward or just generate friction. What both mechanics share is a radically different relationship with effort. Not less effort overall, but effort concentrated so precisely at moments so well chosen that it stops looking like effort from the outside. The result appears effortless because the preparation was invisible. That's the version of Wu Wei that kept ministers alive and kept governments stable for centuries, and it has nothing to do with ease. It's one of the most demanding disciplines in the history of political thought. Wu Wei wasn't invented for people who want to feel better about doing less. It was built for people under real pressure who needed to stay effective and survive. If that version is more useful to you than the candle scent edition, subscribe. That's exactly what this channel is for. And share this with someone who's tired of wisdom that falls apart the moment anything's actually at stake.